you finally found her. The connection is electric. The conversations flow like water. She's laughing at your jokes, texting you back immediately, and for the first time in months, you feel like you're winning at this whole relationship thing. But then, something shifts. She starts taking longer to respond. Her energy feels different. She's suddenly busy more often, and you're left staring at your phone, wondering what the hell you did wrong. Here's the brutal truth. You didn't do anything wrong. You just triggered something deep in her psychology that most men will never understand. And once you see what's really happening beneath the surface, you'll never be confused by a woman's behavior again. 1. The problem amplification. Let me paint you a picture. You've been there. You meet someone incredible. The first few dates are perfect. She's engaged, she's interested, she's making time for you. You think, finally, someone who actually wants to be with me. So, you do what any logical person would do. You lean in. You text her more. You want to see her more often. You start planning your future together. And that's exactly when she disappears. Not physically, but emotionally. She becomes distant. Conversations that used to spark with energy now feel forced. She says she needs space or she's not ready for something serious. Meanwhile, you're left analyzing every text message, every interaction, trying to figure out where you went wrong. Here's what's eating you alive. You followed all the dating advice. You were authentic. You showed interest. You didn't play games. And somehow, your honesty became the very thing that drove her away. The worst part? You start to believe there's something fundamentally wrong with you, that you're too much, too intense, too available. So, you begin to shut down parts of yourself, becoming someone you're not just to avoid this happening again. But what if I told you this has nothing to do with you being too much and everything to do with a psychological pattern that Carl Jung identified over a century ago? Jung's revolutionary insight. Carl Jung, one of the most brilliant minds in psychology, understood something about human nature that most people never grasp. We are all walking contradictions, driven by forces we don't consciously understand. Jung discovered that every person carries within them what he called the shadow, the parts of ourselves we've learned to hide, reject, or deny. For women, especially in relationships, this shadow often contains their deepest fears around vulnerability and losing their sense of self. But here's where it gets interesting. Jung also identified the concept of the anima, the feminine aspect present in every man's psyche. When you start to get close to a woman, you're not just dealing with her conscious mind, you're triggering her unconscious patterns, her shadow fears, and her deepest psychological defense mechanisms. Jung said, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. But what he didn't say explicitly is that sometimes what draws us to someone initially can become exactly what triggers their deepest fears later. When you get closer, you're asking her to do something terrifying, to be truly seen. And for many women, being truly seen means confronting parts of themselves they've spent years hiding, even from themselves. 3. The psychological mechanism explained. Let me break down what's actually happening in her mind when you get closer. Stage 1. The honeymoon phase. In the beginning, she can be her curated self with you, the version of herself she likes most. She's in control of what you see, how much access you have, and how vulnerable she needs to be. This feels safe because she's not risking her authentic self, just the parts she's confident about. Stage 2. The intimacy trigger. But as you get closer, something shifts. Your increased attention and emotional availability starts demanding more from her. Not consciously, but psychologically. Real intimacy requires showing up authentically, which means revealing the parts of herself she's not sure are lovable. Jung called this the confrontation with the shadow. The shadow contains everything we've decided is unacceptable about ourselves, our insecurities, our neediness, our anger, our fears. When someone gets close enough to potentially see these parts, our unconscious mind goes into protection mode. Stage 3. The unconscious retreat. Her pulling away isn't a conscious decision. It's her psyche protecting her from the vulnerability that real intimacy requires. She's not thinking, "I'm going to create distance now." Her unconscious mind is thinking, "This is getting dangerous. I need to regain control." This is why she might say things like, "I'm not ready," or "I need space." She's not lying to you. She's genuinely feeling overwhelmed by forces she doesn't fully understand. The fear. Behind the fear. But what is she really afraid of? It's not you, specifically. It's what you represent. The possibility of being truly known and potentially rejected for who she really is underneath the mask. Every woman carries wounds from past relationships, family dynamics, and societal conditioning that taught her certain parts of herself are too much. When you get close enough to see these parts, her unconscious mind activates every defense mechanism it has. 4. The deeper truth about feminine psychology. Here's what most men don't understand about women. They experience relationships through the lens of emotional safety, not just logical compatibility. Jung understood that women often carry what he called animus possession. They've learned to adapt masculine ways of thinking and being to survive in the world. But deep down, their feminine nature craves something different: psychological and emotional security. When you get closer, you're asking her to drop her defenses. But here's the paradox. The very intensity of your interest can feel overwhelming to her nervous system, not because she doesn't want closeness, but because closeness triggers her deepest fears about losing herself. Women are taught from a young age to be everything to everyone. The good daughter, the successful woman, the perfect partner. But this creates what Jung called persona inflation. They become so identified with who they think they should be that they lose touch with who they actually are. When you get close, you're asking her to be real with you. But what if she's forgotten how to be real with herself? 4.1. The control paradox. Women pull away when you get closer because closeness represents a loss of control. Not control over you, but control over how she's perceived. In the early stages, she can manage the narrative. She can show up as her best self, but real intimacy means showing up as her complete self, including the parts she's not proud of. This is why women often test men psychologically. They're not trying to manipulate you. They're trying to see if you can handle the parts of them they're most afraid to show. 4.2. The abandonment versus engulfment dilemma. Jung identified that many people are caught between two core fears: the fear of abandonment and the fear of engulfment. For women, this often manifests as wanting closeness but pulling away when they get it. They want to be chosen and pursued, but when you actually choose and pursue them, it triggers their fear of losing their individuality. This isn't conscious. It's a deep psychological pattern that plays out automatically. 5. Why this happens to the good guys. If you're a man who experiences this pattern repeatedly, you're probably what I call unconsciously triggering. You're doing everything right on the surface, but you're inadvertently activating her deepest psychological defenses. The intensity factor. Good guys tend to be all in when they meet someone they connect with. You show genuine interest. You make time. You communicate openly. But to a woman's nervous system, this can feel overwhelming, not because it's wrong, but because it's asking her to match your level of emotional availability before she's ready. The security paradox. Here's the twisted irony. The more secure and stable you are, the more you might trigger her insecurity. Why? Because your stability highlights her own internal chaos. Your emotional availability forces her to confront her own emotional unavailability. Jung understood that we often reject in others what we haven't accepted in ourselves. If she's not comfortable with her own neediness, your emotional needs will feel suffocating. If she's not comfortable with her own depth, your depth will feel overwhelming. The nice guy trap. Nice guys often make the mistake of thinking that more attention, more affection, and more availability will win her over. But what you're actually doing is increasing the pressure on her to be equally available, which triggers her fears about losing herself in the relationship. This isn't about playing games or being unavailable. It's about understanding that emotional intimacy has to develop at a pace that feels safe to her nervous system. 6. The shadow work element. Jung believed that the path to psychological wholeness requires integrating our shadow, the parts of ourselves we've rejected or denied. For women who pull away when things get close, the shadow often contains their authentic needs and desires. She might have learned that being needy is bad, so she rejects that part of herself. But when you get close, your presence naturally brings up her needs, and she doesn't know how to handle them in a healthy way. She might have learned that being emotional is weakness, so she's developed a tough exterior. But intimacy requires emotional vulnerability, and she doesn't have the tools to be vulnerable without feeling completely exposed. She might have learned that her worth comes from being independent, so depending on someone feels like losing her identity. The integration challenge. When you get close to someone, you're asking them to integrate parts of themselves they've been avoiding. This is terrifying work. It requires facing the parts of themselves they've decided are unacceptable. Most people would rather stay surface level than do this deep psychological work. Pulling away is easier than facing their shadow. But here's what's beautiful about this understanding. When you recognize this pattern, you stop taking it personally. You realize that her pulling away isn't about you, it's about her relationship with herself. 7. How to respond with psychological wisdom. So what do you do when she pulls away? Most men make one of two mistakes. They either chase harder or they give up completely. Both responses come from not understanding the psychological mechanism at play. The Jungian approach. 1. Don't chase the symptom. Her pulling away is not the real issue. It's a symptom of her internal psychological conflict. Chasing her when she pulls away only increases the pressure and confirms her unconscious fear that closeness means losing control. 2. Provide unconscious safety. Instead of pursuing her directly, you create what Jung would call psychological holding space. You remain consistent and present without being overwhelming. You show her that you can handle her complexity without trying to fix it. 3. Address the shadow, not the persona. Don't respond to what she's saying on the surface. Respond to what she's really communicating underneath. When she says, "I need space," she's really saying, "I'm scared of losing myself." When she becomes distant, she's really saying, "I don't know how to be close without being overwhelmed." 4. Model integration. The most powerful thing you can do is demonstrate that you've done your own shadow work. Show her that you can be close without losing yourself, that you can handle emotional complexity without becoming reactive. Practical application. When she pulls away, don't immediately try to close the distance. Acknowledge her need for space without making it about you. Continue being consistent in your character without chasing her validation. Show her through your actions that intimacy doesn't have to mean losing individuality. The counterintuitive move. Sometimes the most psychologically intelligent response to someone pulling away is to give them space while remaining emotionally available. This communicates that you understand intimacy requires both closeness and autonomy. 8. The transformation. Possibility. Here's what changes when you understand this psychological pattern. You stop being a victim of women's behavior and start being a conscious participant in the dance of intimacy. What her? When you respond with psychological wisdom instead of neediness or anger, you create the safety she needs to explore her own shadow. You become the secure base that allows her to do the internal work required for real intimacy. Many women have never experienced a man who could hold space for their complexity without trying to fix it or taking it personally. When you provide this, you're giving her something incredibly rare and valuable. For you develop what Jung called psychological differentiation, the ability to remain yourself in the presence of someone else's emotional chaos. This is one of the most attractive qualities a man can develop. You stop wasting energy trying to decode mixed signals and start understanding the deeper psychological currents underneath surface behavior. The relationship transformation. Instead of the typical push-pull dynamic that destroys most relationships, you create a container where both people can be fully themselves, where intimacy becomes about mutual growth rather than mutual need. This is what Jung meant when he talked about individuation within relationship, the process of becoming fully yourself while being in conscious relationship with another. 9. The deeper pattern across all relationships. Once you understand this pattern with women, you'll start seeing it everywhere. People pull away when things get real because reality is complicated, messy, and requires us to face parts of ourselves we'd rather avoid. The universal truth. Every human being is walking around with parts of themselves they've learned to hide. When someone gets close enough to potentially see these parts, our unconscious defenses activate. This happens in friendships, business relationships, family dynamics, the anywhere. Real intimacy is possible. Why most relationships stay surface level. Most people prefer the comfort of shallow connection over the challenge of deep intimacy. It's easier to keep things light than to risk being truly seen and potentially rejected. But the people who are willing to do the psychological work, who are willing to face their shadow and integrate their complexity, these are the people who create extraordinary relationships. The conscious choice. Every time someone pulls away when things get close, you have a choice. You can take it personally and react from your own wounds, or you can recognize it as their psychological process and respond with wisdom. The men who understand this dynamic become incredibly attractive to psychologically mature women because they represent safety, not the safety of never being challenged, but the safety of being accepted in their full complexity. 10. Why this knowledge is power. Understanding feminine psychology at this level changes everything about how you approach relationships. You stop being confused by behavior that once drove you crazy. You stop taking things personally that were never about you. You become predictably unpredictable. Most men respond to women's complexity with either overwhelm or withdrawal. When you can remain centered and present in the face of psychological complexity, you become incredibly attractive because you're providing something most men can't. Emotional leadership. You develop genuine confidence. Real confidence comes from understanding the game being played. When you understand the psychological forces at work underneath surface behavior, you can respond consciously instead of reactively. You attract different quality women. Women who are doing their own psychological work will be drawn to a man who understands these dynamics. Women who aren't ready for this level of depth will naturally filter themselves out. This knowledge becomes a screening mechanism that helps you find someone who's actually ready for the kind of relationship you want. The challenge and the opportunity. Here's the hard truth. Understanding this intellectually is easy. Living it when you're emotionally invested in someone is incredibly difficult. When someone you care about starts pulling away, every instinct in your body will tell you to chase them, to fix it, to do something. Responding with psychological wisdom requires you to act against your immediate impulses. The real work. This requires you to do your own shadow work. You have to face the parts of yourself that want to control the outcome, that can't handle uncertainty, that need constant validation. You have to develop what Jung called holding the tension of opposites, being able to want closeness while allowing distance, being able to care deeply while not being attached to a specific outcome. The reward. But when you master this, you become the kind of man that psychologically mature women dream of finding. Someone who can handle their complexity without being overwhelmed by it. Someone who can provide emotional safety without trying to control them. You become someone who can create the conditions for real intimacy to develop naturally. Final conclusion, the path forward. So the next time a woman pulls away when you get closer, remember this. She's not rejecting you. She's having a psychological reaction to the possibility of real intimacy. Your job isn't to fix her, chase her, or convince her to stay. Your job is to understand what's happening underneath the surface and respond with the kind of psychological wisdom that creates safety for real connection. This is advanced relationship psychology. Most men will never understand this level of human complexity. But you're not most men. You're someone who's willing to look beneath the surface and understand what's really driving human behavior. The question: are you going to use this knowledge to become the kind of man who can create extraordinary relationships? Or are you going to go back to taking women's behavior personally and wondering why the same patterns keep repeating? The choice is yours. But now you have the psychological tools to choose consciously. Your next step: start observing this pattern in your own relationships. Notice when someone pulls away and practice responding with curiosity instead of reactivity. Practice providing psychological safety instead of trying to control the outcome. This is how you become psychologically sophisticated. This is how you create relationships that go beyond the surface. And if you want to dive deeper into understanding the psychology behind human behavior in relationships, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Because we're just getting started with the real psychology that most people will never understand. The game changes when you understand what's really happening beneath the surface. And you're now ahead of 95% of men who will spend their lives confused by behavior that makes perfect psychological sense once you know what to look for. Subscribe for more psychology-based relationship insights. Comment below with your experiences and from where you are watching this video.